Welcome to Congress in Context. We are doing a really massive deep dive today.
Yeah, we have a ton of material to get through.
We really do. We're taking this huge stack of primary sources, so, hundreds of pages of raw congressional records, dense bill summaries, procedural documents, and just verbatim floor speeches from the June 24, 2026 legislative session.
Right.
And the goal here is to just synthesize all of that. We want to cut through the political noise and help you, the listener, understand exactly what is happening inside the machinery of your government.
And, it's such a critical exercise, I think, because the narrative you usually see on the evening news is, well, it's fundamentally incomplete.
You get the loudest soundbites.
Right. But you rarely get the context, and you almost never get the actual mechanics of the legislation that will, frankly, impact your life.
Yeah, exactly. And before we jump into the deep end here, just a really quick housekeeping note. This deep dive is a completely independent, ad-free civic education project.
No corporate sponsors here.
Right, we do not have corporate sponsors dictating our coverage. We rely entirely on listeners like you to keep this production infrastructure running.
Right.
So if you find this breakdown valuable, we would be incredibly grateful if you could just use the Buy Me a Coffee link, which is located right in the show notes for this deep dive in your app.
Yeah, it really just allows us to spend our time translating all this dense congressional record stuff so you can get the unvarnished insights.
Exactly. So looking at this June 24 session, we had this really fascinating, almost jarring juxtaposition happening simultaneously in the Capitol.
It's wild.
It is. On one hand, you have a highly functioning, totally bipartisan House of Representatives quietly passing granular, highly technical legislation without a single dissenting vote.
Right, which you never hear about.
Never. And then, in the very same building, you have deeply entrenched, just emotionally charged ideological warfare over the 4th anniversary of the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision.
And all of this is unfolding under a very specific historical shadow, too.
Yeah.
The impending Semi-Quincentennial.
Right, the 250th anniversary.
Exactly. The 250th anniversary of the United States is looming over this Congress, and it's forcing this kind of reluctant historical reflection on a body that is otherwise just, consumed by the daily partisan grind.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we need to start with the actual machinery. Before we get to the fiery floor speeches, we have to look at the dry mechanics of vote counts.
The stuff that actually moves.
Yes, the part of Congress that totally defies the gridlock narrative. Let's examine the House floor and a piece of legislation that passed with a staggering 415-0 vote.
Which is just
insane, right?
Yeah.
H.R. 2478, the Financial Exploitation Prevention Act of 2025.
Yeah, a unanimous vote in the modern House is incredibly rare. I mean, to get 415 members of Congress to agree on, what to order for lunch is a minor miracle, let alone agreeing on a federal statute.
Right. I should note, one member, Representative Luna, changed her vote from yea to present, and 15 members were absent, but absolutely zero nays. So this bill amends the Investment Company Act of 1940 to allow the postponement of redemptions of certain securities if financial exploitation of a specified adult, specifically senior citizens, is suspected.
So to understand the mechanism here, you really have to look at the law it modifies.
The 1941.
Yeah, the Investment Company Act of 1940. It was foundational New Deal legislation. It basically built the regulatory framework for modern mutual funds. And one of the core tenets written into that law to protect consumers was the requirement for prompt redemption.
Okay, meaning what exactly?
The law essentially said, if you own shares in a mutual fund and you want to cash out, the financial institution cannot drag its feet. They must give you your money quickly.
Well, that makes total sense for 1940, and honestly, it makes sense right now. You don't want a bank or a massive investment firm holding your retirement savings hostage just to, maintain their own liquidity.
Exactly. The intention was consumer protection. However, modern financial exploitation weaponizes that exact protection.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, fraudsters today use highly sophisticated psychological manipulation. They often target vulnerable adults on fixed incomes to convince them to liquidate their accounts.
Like the classic phone scams.
Right. They might use a romance scam, a fake IRS threat, or, a grandchild in trouble scenario.
So under the strict reading of that 1940 law, the broker sitting at the investment firm might look at a transaction, see that their 85-year-old client is suddenly liquidating a $200,000 mutual fund to wire it overseas, and they strongly suspect it's a scam.
Yep.
But legally, they were required to process it promptly anyway.
Their hands were tied. If they delayed the transaction, they risked violating federal law and facing major regulatory penalties. And once that money is wired out, particularly into cryptocurrency or like offshore accounts,
It vanishes.
it vanishes. The recovery rate for elder financial fraud is vanishingly small.
So this bill essentially builds a legally protected, like, pause button into the 1940 framework.
Exactly. It creates a safe harbor. If the investment company has a reasonable belief that financial exploitation is occurring, H.R. 2478 allows them to delay the redemption of those securities for a specified window.
Which gives them time.
Right. It gives adult protective services, state securities regulators, or law enforcement the time they actually need to investigate before the assets are irretrievably lost.
You know, it's the institutional equivalent of what happens when a credit card company spots an anomaly. Like if I buy a coffee in New York and an hour later there's a charge for a $5,000 electronics purchase in Paris, my bank freezes the card.
Spot on.
This legislation just takes that basic fraud prevention logic and applies it to complex securities. And the fact that it passed 415 to 0 just indicates that this specific vulnerability in the aging population transcends every conceivable political boundary.
It really does. And we also saw that exact same bipartisan consensus applied to small business infrastructure. So H.R. 7401, the Small Business Lending Fraud Prevention Act, that also passed 415 to 0.
Yeah, and my reading of this bill is that it's a direct, albeit maybe delayed, response to the chaos of massive federal lending programs of the past few years.
Definitely.
It requires employees of the Small Business Administration to formally certify that they have no prohibited conflicts of interest regarding the loans they're processing or overseeing.
Right. It forces a paper trail of accountability. When you have an agency rapidly deploying billions of dollars in economic relief or development loans, the temptation for internal corruption or favoritism is immense.
Yeah, the floodgates open.
Exactly. So this bill removes any ambiguity. If an SBA employee is steering federal funds to a business they have a silent stake in or, a business owned by an immediate family member, this certification requirement makes it far easier to prosecute them for fraud because they had to actively sign a document denying the conflict.
Makes total sense. And then we have H.R. 915, the Small Business Technological Act. This one passed 414 to 4. And it authorizes the SBA to provide loans specifically to finance access to modern business software for small businesses.
What's fascinating here is how these votes reveal that despite media narratives of total gridlock, granular, practical economic legislation still moves with near universal consent. Because the economic reality is that a local hardware store or, say, an independent pharmacy, they're not just competing with the shop down the street anymore.
No, they're competing with Amazon.
Right. Global logistics giants, if they are running on legacy, server-in-the-closet software, they cannot manage inventory efficiently, they can't protect customer data from cyber threats, and they certainly cannot optimize their supply chains.
But enterprise-grade cloud computing and modern point-of-sale systems, that requires significant upfront capital, which mom-and-pop shops rarely have sitting in reserve.
Exactly. And this legislation allows the federal government to underwrite that specific technological leap. It basically treats software infrastructure with the exact same importance as physical infrastructure.
Now, I do want to address those 4 nay votes.
Right.
Representatives Brashean, Burchett, Massey, and Roy. We don't have their floor speeches on this specific bill in our sources, but observing their voting patterns, this absolutely aligns with a strict fiscal conservative philosophy.
Yeah, the argument is likely structural. Even if the goal of helping a local bakery upgrade its software is, sympathetic, the philosophical counterargument is that the federal government shouldn't be intervening in private enterprise capital expenditures.
Like, it's not the government's job.
Right. They view authorizing new federal lending programs, even for really popular causes, as an expansion of the administrative state and a long-term liability for the taxpayer.
That is the philosophical fault line, yeah. But 414 members crossed it to support the measure.
Yeah.
Now, seeing these bills hit the floor for a final tally is one thing, but the actual architecture of this legislation happens long before the cameras turn on, right? The real engine room of Congress is the committee system.
Yeah, the floor vote is merely the showroom. The committees are the factory floor. And on June 24, that factory was operating at absolute maximum capacity.
It really was. The Appropriations Committee advanced the Defense Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2027. We are going to touch on the defense budget later, but that alone is a massive undertaking.
Huge.
Meanwhile, the Homeland Security Committee was engaged in an absolute legislative blitz They marked up over a dozen bills in a single day.
Yeah, and to understand how a committee processes 15 complex bills in a single session, we really have to look at the markup process. This is the stage where committee members gather to literally mark up the text of a bill, debating amendments section by section.
But they clearly aren't reading 15 brand new bills from scratch in one afternoon.
No, definitely not. By the time a bill reaches a full committee markup, the heavy lifting has already been done by committee staff and subcommittees. The language has been negotiated, the stakeholders have been consulted, all the compromises have been drafted.
So it's mostly finished.
Yeah. Committee leadership will bundle these thoroughly vetted bills together. They can move the non-controversial ones quickly via voice votes, just clearing the backlog so they can send a whole slate of legislation to the House floor.
Okay, so let's look at the scope of what Homeland Security was moving.
Yeah.
H.R. 7574, the ELO Realignment and Strategic Engagement Reform Act of 2026. This forces the Secretary of Homeland Security to reorganize the engagement, liaison, and outreach office to identify redundant positions and ensure continuity of intelligence support.
Which is classic congressional oversight. Departments, especially massive ones like DHS, naturally drift toward bureaucratic bloat. Congress is using its legislative authority here to force an internal audit and realignment to ensure intelligence sharing isn't just bogged down by redundant middle management.
Right. But then you look at H.R. 9394, the Civil Preparedness for Agro-terrorism Exercise Act of 2026.
Yeah, this one is intense.
It requires DHS to conduct specialized exercises related to agro-terrorism. And, when people think of terrorism, they usually think of kinetic attacks, like explosives or maybe cyber attacks on the power grid. Agro-terrorism is a completely different and, frankly, terrifying threat vector.
It really is. It's the deliberate introduction of a disease or pathogen into the agricultural sector.
Wow.
Yeah, we are talking about targeting crops or livestock. An adversary doesn't need to attack a military base if they can introduce foot and mouth disease into the cattle supply or, a fungal pathogen into the wheat belt.
The economic ripple effects of that would be instantaneous and catastrophic.
It would trigger immediate global export bans on American agricultural products. It would devastate the rural economy, cause massive supply chain disruptions, and honestly lead to immediate panic at the grocery store level.
So this bill mandates the DHS actually run simulations. What does a tabletop exercise for agro-terrorism even look like?
Well, they have to coordinate local farmers, state departments of agriculture, federal law enforcement, transportation networks. They have to figure out how to quarantine a region and stabilize the food supply before a real attack happens.
It is fascinating that this is moving through the exact same committee on the very same day as bureaucratic realignment bills and things like the Safeguards Act, which is H.R. 8770.
It just demonstrates the sprawling jurisdiction of the Homeland Security apparatus.
Yeah. Now, while the House was running this factory line, the Senate was engaged in its constitutional duty of advice and consent, confirming federal judges. These are lifetime appointments which fundamentally alter the trajectory of the federal judiciary.
And they confirmed 2 district court judges on this day. Michael J. Hendershot was confirmed to the Northern District of Ohio by a vote of 50 to 44.
That is a razor-thin margin for a district court nominee. And the record shows Senator Durbin actively opposed Hendershot based on his previous work in the Ohio Attorney General's office. Specifically, his defense of state laws restricting abortion access, particularly after Ohio voters had moved to enshrine reproductive rights in their state constitution.
Right, and this reflects the new reality of judicial confirmations. The era of the Senate just deferring to the president's district court picks and passing them by unanimous consent is effectively dead.
It's long gone.
Every piece of paper a nominee has ever signed, every brief they have ever filed as a state attorney is meticulously scrutinized. The opposing party will use those past legal defenses as a proxy for the nominee's personal judicial philosophy.
Yeah. And the second confirmation was George Edward Mark to the Southern District of Texas. He was confirmed 52 to 45. And the detail that really stands out here is a remark from Senator Coons of Delaware regarding the confirmation hearings. He noted that he specifically asked Mark, along with other nominees, a very basic question. He asked, what does the 22nd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution provide?
Well, the 22nd Amendment limits the president to 2 terms in office. It's a really fundamental piece of constitutional architecture.
Right. And my initial thought reading that was, why is a sitting U.S. senator giving a pop quiz on high school civics to a federal judicial nominee? I mean, it feels almost patronizing.
It does, but it isn't a test of rote memorization. It's actually a stress test of immediate recall and a probe into the nominee's broader constitutional awareness under pressure.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, a district court judge will regularly face emergency injunctions involving the limits of executive power. Senator Coons is looking for fluency. If a nominee stumbles on the structural amendments governing the presidency, it raises legitimate concerns about their depth of preparation and their ability to navigate complex separation of powers cases on the bench.
So it's a way of ensuring the nominee isn't just a political appointee, but a jurist with a constitution constantly loaded in their working memory.
Exactly.
So we see the mechanics humming along, the unanimous House bills, the committee markups, the Senate confirmations. But now we really have to pivot. We are moving from the procedural to the visceral.
The ideological warfare that defines the modern Congress.
Right. And on June 24th, 2026, that warfare was centered on the exact 4-year anniversary of the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, the decision that overturned Roe v. Wade. Now, I want to pause right here and address you, the listener, directly. Our sources contain deeply emotional, highly charged political rhetoric from both sides of the aisle regarding this anniversary. We are absolutely not here to endorse a viewpoint or pick a side. Our objective is strict impartiality. We're going to analyze exactly how differently the two sides of the aisle conceptualize the fundamental idea of liberty in America, using their own arguments from the congressional record.
The fault line here is just profound. Let's examine the perspective of conservative lawmakers first, who view the Dobbs decision as a generational triumph of both constitutional law and moral imperative.
Right. In the Senate, Senator Daines and dozens of his colleagues introduced Senate Resolution 787. This is a formal commemoration of the anniversary. The text of the resolution is explicit. It celebrates the overturning of Roe, arguing that the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion.
And it emphasizes the protection of the unalienable right to life and safeguarding unborn lives. And crucially, from a structural standpoint, it celebrates the return of regulatory authority over this issue to the states and the elected representatives of the people.
And we saw this structural and moral argument amplified during a special order hour in the House, which was organized by Representative Blake Moore of Utah.
Right, and a special order hour allows members to coordinate and speak at length on a single topic, effectively dominating the congressional record for that period.
Speaker of the House Mike Johnson utilized this time, which is significant given the demands on the Speaker's schedule. He framed the Dobbs decision directly within the context of the Declaration of Independence. He argued that the unalienable right to life is the foundation of the American project.
And Representative Kamak of Florida echoed that structural argument, noting that Dobbs returned one of the most consequential societal questions back to the democratic process at the state level.
Over in the Senate, Senator Ted Cruz delivered a comprehensive speech. He characterized the decision as a triumph of conviction, compassion, and courage. He framed it as the culmination of 50 years of grassroots activism, millions of Americans praying and marching. He also introduced a push to designate June as Life Month to cement this viewpoint in the national calendar.
But the speech that really brought the most specific personal context came from Representative Kennedy of Utah.
Yeah.
He spoke not just as a legislator, but as a practicing physician. He stated on the floor that he has seen firsthand the heartbeat of an infant on an ultrasound, and he has placed newborns into the arms of their mothers. He argued that his fundamental duty as a physician is the protection of life, and he views his legislative duty as a direct extension of that medical oath.
So, the unified conservative argument is that Roe was a constitutional aberration that disenfranchised voters, and Dobbs was a necessary restoration of order, allowing states to protect fetal personhood. Now, we shift to the opposing perspective. For left-wing lawmakers, the exact same anniversary is viewed as a catastrophic stripping of fundamental human rights.
In the House, Representative Latimer delivered a 1-minute speech that crystallized this view. He argued that the anniversary marks the loss of a constitutional right that had been relied upon for half a century.
Latimer's core argument focused on the intrusion of the state into the medical examination room. He stated he could not fathom a scenario where a person is forced to make a life-or-death medical decision based on the dictates of politicians and courts, rather than the expertise of their doctors.
Right.
His argument is that liberty requires bodily autonomy and privacy from government mandates.
And Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin provided a localized, really stark example of the immediate fallout from the decision. She highlighted that because Roe was overturned, women in Wisconsin were subjected to a law passed in 1849 for an 18-month period.
An 1849 law. A law written before the Civil War, before the widespread use of anesthesia, before women even had the right to vote. Suddenly, that statute was dictating modern reproductive health care in 2026.
Yeah. Senator Baldwin used this to argue that overturning Roe was not an end state, but the beginning of a broader campaign to dismantle access to reproductive care entirely.
And she raised this point while objecting to a conservative bill that she argued would strip funding from family planning clinics. It really illustrates how this ideological divide immediately translates into procedural warfare over federal funding.
You have two completely irreconcilable definitions of liberty operating in the exact same chamber.
Yes.
One side defines liberty as the right to life for the unborn and the democratic right of states to govern themselves. The other side defines liberty as bodily autonomy and the right to make private medical decisions free from state coercion.
There's absolutely no middle ground in these speeches.
None. And that unyielding ideological tension bleeds into seemingly unrelated areas of legislation. The tension is so high that basic governance becomes essentially a hostage situation.
Which brings us to the housing bill veto threat. Representative Mejia of Florida pointed out that a rare, bipartisan housing affordability bill, H.R. 6644, designed to help families struggling with rising rents and mortgage rates, had been successfully negotiated and passed.
It was a tangible legislative achievement, but Representative Chick Roy of Texas provided the crucial context for what happened next.
Right.
The president was scheduled to travel to the Capitol for a bill signing ceremony. Instead, he threatened a veto and refused to sign the housing bill unless Congress simultaneously passed the Save America Act.
And the Save America Act is legislation specifically aimed at ensuring only American citizens can vote in federal elections, establishing new mechanisms to prevent foreign nationals from voting.
Right.
It is a massive priority for the executive branch and the conservative base.
This is raw political leverage. The executive branch is basically telling the legislative branch, you will not get a political victory on housing affordability, even one with bipartisan support, unless you concede to our demands on election security.
Representative Roy vigorously defended this tactic on the floor. He argued that securing elections is the paramount duty of the government, and using leverage to force it through is totally justified.
While Representative Mejia framed it as despotic, arguing the president was holding working families hostage for a political agenda.
It's a fascinating display of hardball tactics, where the merits of the housing bill are completely irrelevant. It is simply a bargaining chip.
And these clashes are not just inter-branch. We also see intense intra-congressional conflict. On the same day, Representative Roy delivered a really blistering populist attack aimed directly at his own colleagues over the issue of congressional stock trading.
Oh man, this was one of those moments where the decorum of the House just drops away completely. Representative Roy aggressively called out members of Congress who are actively day trading stocks while sitting in office. His quote from the record is incredibly blunt. He said, "There were only 435 of us. If you don't like it, then leave."
He's highlighting a profound conflict of interest that just infuriates the public. I mean, members of Congress sit on committees that regulate massive sectors of the economy, pharmaceuticals, defense, technology.
Yep.
They receive classified briefings and closed-door insights into regulatory actions long before the market does.
If you sit on the Armed Services Committee and you're actively buying and selling stock in defense contractors while writing the defense budget, I mean, the perception of corruption is inescapable, regardless of whether a specific trade violates the incredibly loose rules of the Stock Act. What's remarkable about this speech is that this anti-establishment anger totally crosses the aisle. You have the most conservative members and the most progressive members completely agreeing that lawmakers should not be managing personal stock portfolios.
It speaks to a deep structural frustration with the institution itself. The floor is being used to publicly shame colleagues.
And we saw another masterclass in using the floor as a megaphone in the Senate, with Senator Bernie Sanders speaking on S.J. Res. 196. This was a resolution aimed at overturning a Department of Education rule regarding student loans.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Senator Sanders used the procedural resolution to prosecute a much broader macroeconomic argument. He laid out the statistics: 42 million Americans holding $1.7 trillion in student debt, with 9 million Americans currently in default.
He severely criticized the Trump administration, arguing they had enacted the largest cuts to education in U.S. history. He framed this not as a budget necessity, but as an ideological choice.
Right.
He argued that the administration was cutting education funding to subsidize tax breaks for the ultra-wealthy, while actively pricing working-class students out of essential fields like nursing and medicine. He stated the administration was poised to increase loan payments by an average of $4,000 for millions of Americans, making a crisis exponentially worse.
When you look at these speeches, Roy, on stock trading, Sanders on student debt, the deeply opposed views on Dobbs, you realize the floor is primarily a theater for establishing political narratives.
Definitely.
Yes, bills are passed, but the debate time is utilized to generate the sound bites that will define the upcoming election cycles.
But how does this specific day of political theater fit into the larger historical arc? Because Congress is acutely aware that they are legislating in the shadow of a massive milestone.
Right, the Semi-Quincentennial, July 4th, 2026, the 250th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence.
We see the logistical preparation for this in SCON RES 35, which is a concurrent resolution calling for a joint session of Congress to be held in Philadelphia on July 2, 2026.
The historical weight of this anniversary is clearly permeating the chamber. Senator Coons of Delaware delivered a reflective speech that explicitly linked the present polarization to the past. He recalled the bicentennial in 1976.
And 1976 was a chaotic era. The country had just endured the trauma of the Vietnam War, the constitutional crisis and resignation of Nixon during Watergate, and just intense social upheaval. It was not a unified nation celebrating a birthday.
No, not at all. And Senator Coons drew a direct parallel. He noted that the bicentennial occurred during a period of intense, bitter division, much like 2026. But he argued that the anniversary forced the American people to pause.
Yeah.
It created a mandatory moment of reflection on the foundational principles that ostensibly bind the country together, despite the political tumult.
It's like a deeply dysfunctional family reunion.
Hmm.
Half the family is embroiled in a lawsuit, siblings aren't speaking. But when the grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary arrives, everyone is forced to put on a suit, show up, eat the catering, and briefly acknowledge they share a bloodline.
That is a great way to put it.
The Semi-Quincentennial is establishing a shared baseline for a Congress that literally cannot agree on anything else.
And Representative Roy brought up another historical detail that adds a layer of reverence to this baseline. He reminded the chamber that July 4, 2026 is not just the 250th anniversary of the nation, it is the 200th anniversary of the deaths of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams.
Which remains one of the most stunning historical coincidences on record. Jefferson and Adams, the primary architects of the Declaration, bitter political rivals who waged vicious campaigns against each other before reconciling in their twilight years. They both died on the exact same day, July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the document was signed.
It's poetic. Representative Roy used this timeline to argue that whether you attribute it to divine providence or historical poetry, it should force lawmakers to recognize the gravity of the institution they inhabit.
It definitely puts the daily bickering over procedure into stark perspective. Speaking of procedure, let's explore a few specific insights into how this machine actually operates. We talked earlier about the financial exploitation bill passing 415-0. How does a bill navigate the partisan gauntlet to achieve that?
It relies on a specific procedural maneuver called suspension of the rules. When the leadership of the House identifies a bill that has overwhelming bipartisan support, usually practical, non-controversial legislation, they can bring it to the floor under a motion to suspend the rules.
I always hear that phrase, but what rules are they actually suspending? Are they just, like, ignoring the rule book?
They are suspending the normal, grueling rules of debate and the amendment process.
Okay.
Under normal order, a bill can be debated for hours or days, and members can offer endless amendments to change the text, which often derails the legislation entirely. Suspending the rules places the bill on a high-speed track. Debate is strictly limited to 40 minutes, and absolutely no floor amendments are allowed. You vote on the exact text presented.
But doesn't that bypass the core function of a democratic legislature? If leadership can just cut off debate and ban amendments, couldn't they ram through highly controversial bills?
That is exactly why there is a safeguard built into the maneuver. To pass a bill under suspension of the rules, it requires a two-thirds supermajority, not a simple majority. You trade the arduous debate process for the requirement of overwhelming consensus. It proves that Congress has a functional fast lane when they actually agree.
Let's contrast that fast lane with a piece of legislation that represents a fundamental structural debate about the American economy. H.R. 5396. Our sources contain a summary of this bill, which aims to amend the Federal Reserve Act to remove the dual mandate.
This is a seismic proposition. The Federal Reserve, which is the central banking system of the United States, operates under a dual mandate established by Congress in 1977. They have two primary statutory objectives: maximize employment and maintain stable prices, which means controlling inflation.
And the problem is, those two objectives are constantly at war with each other.
They are inherently contradictory. If inflation is running hot, the Fed's primary weapon is raising interest rates. This makes borrowing more expensive, which slows down economic growth and cools off prices.
Right.
But cooling off the economy inevitably leads to businesses scaling back operations, which leads to layoffs. So, fighting inflation almost always hurts employment. Conversely, if unemployment is high, the Fed lowers interest rates to stimulate borrowing and hiring, but that flood of cheap money can trigger inflation.
It's like trying to fly a plane while being ordered to maintain maximum altitude and maximum speed simultaneously. Eventually you stall. So what does H.R. 5396 propose?
The bill proposes stripping away the employment mandate entirely. It would legally require the Federal Reserve to focus singularly on price stability.
That is a massive macroeconomic shift. If this were law and inflation spiked, the Fed would be legally obligated to raise rates and crush inflation, even if they knew it would trigger a severe recession and massive unemployment.
Exactly.
They would no longer have to balance the human cost of job losses against the monetary cost of inflation.
Precisely. Proponents of this bill argue that the Fed's attempts to manage employment are ineffective and inevitably lead to the crippling inflation we have seen recently. They argue a central bank should only manage the currency.
Sure.
Opponents argue this removes the only structural protection the working class has against a central bank intentionally inducing a recession to protect the assets of the wealthy. It is a debate over the very philosophy of American capitalism, quietly moving through the committee structure.
So if that is the kind of profound structural change Congress is debating today, what seeds are they planting for tomorrow? We have to look at the future implications found within the NDAA.
The National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2027, Senate Bill S-4784.
Our sources are just overflowing with amendments attached to this single defense bill. We're seeing legislation about education, algorithms, and the dark web attached to the budget that funds aircraft carriers. Why?
Because the NDAA is the ultimate must-pass legislative vehicle. Funding the military is one of the few constitutional duties that Congress absolutely cannot ignore. Lawmakers know this bill is guaranteed to cross the finish line.
It's a guaranteed ride.
Exactly. Therefore, they treat it like a departing train. They frantically try to attach their own, often unrelated, forward-looking legislation to it as amendments, hoping to hitch a ride to the president's desk.
And when you analyze these amendments, you realize Congress is desperately trying to lasso the exponential curve of modern technology. Let's start with artificial intelligence. We see the National AI Education Initiative establishing grants to integrate AI into K-12 education. They want to prepare the workforce. But simultaneously, they are terrified of the technology. Look at Senate Amendment 6108, the Blade Act.
This amendment is designed specifically to protect closed-source artificial intelligence models.
We need to define that distinction really quick. Open source versus closed source AI.
Open source AI means the underlying architecture, the code, and the mathematical weights of the model are publicly available. Anyone can download it, inspect it, and modify it. Closed source models, which represent the bleeding edge of the technology developed by major tech companies, are heavily guarded trade secrets. The public can interact with the AI, but the underlying logic remains hidden inside a black box.
The Blade Act views these advanced closed-source models as vital to the national security and economic dominance of the United States. And they're trying to protect them from something called adversarial distillation. What exactly is that? It sounds intense.
It is, yeah. Adversarial distillation is a highly sophisticated method of technological theft. An adversary, say, a foreign intelligence service, doesn't need to hack into a tech company's servers to steal the code.
Okay.
Instead, they use a cheaper open-source AI model to systematically bombard the advanced closed-source model with millions of queries. By analyzing the high-quality outputs of the advanced model, the cheaper model learns and mimics the hidden logic. It's essentially reverse engineering the AI's brain from the outside.
Wow, it's stealing the intellectual property without ever breaking through the firewall. And Congress is trying to weaponize the defense budget to make that illegal. But then in the very same bill, we see Senate Amendment 6188, which proposes an outright prohibition on the use of certain AI models across the entire federal government.
It highlights a profound legislative whiplash. They are funding AI in elementary schools, building legal shields to protect corporate AI secrets from foreign distillation, and simultaneously trying to ban AI from federal agencies because they do not trust its security or reliability.
It is the hallmark of a legislative body that realizes it is fundamentally outpaced by technology. And AI isn't the only frontier. Look at Senate Amendment 6434, the Dark Web Interdiction Act.
The congressional findings in this amendment are stark. They explicitly define the dark web as overlay networks that provide total anonymity through multiple encrypted traffic relays.
This refers to things like onion routing, where data is wrapped in layers of encryption and bounced through random servers globally, so no single node knows both where the data originated and where it is going. The amendment bluntly states that this structural anonymity allows criminal enterprises to host illicit material in a way that completely circumvenes the ability of law enforcement to serve legal process. Congress is formally acknowledging that there are regions of the internet where the sovereignty of the United States government simply does not exist.
And this structural inability to enforce the law ties directly into the Defiance Act, which is Senate Amendment 11101. This targets the proliferation of explicit forged images, deepfakes.
Right.
The legislation notes that the technology required to generate hyper-realistic, non-consensual synthetic media is now ubiquitous, cheap, and requires zero technical expertise.
They are acknowledging that the digital reality has become malleable, and they are trying to use the defense authorization to fight back against smartphone apps generating fake images. But the legislative scope expands even further, beyond the digital realm and into actual orbit.
Yeah.
Senate Amendment 6066 is the Orbital Sustainability Act, or the Orbits Act.
This amendment addresses the critical issue of space debris. The findings state that operations in low Earth orbit are increasingly endangered by a rapidly growing volume of defunct satellites, spent rocket stages, and shrapnel.
This touches on Kessler syndrome, the theoretical scenario where the density of garbage in low Earth orbit becomes so high that a single collision creates a cascade of debris, generating more collisions, until the entire orbital plane is effectively impassable.
Which is terrifying because we rely on low Earth orbit for global communications, GPS, financial timing signals, and military surveillance. If we pollute that environment with high-velocity shrapnel, we lose access to modern infrastructure entirely.
The Orbits Act is an attempt to establish regulatory sustainability in space before that cascade occurs. And finally, perhaps the most paradigm-shifting amendment attached to the NDAA is the UAP Disclosure Act of 2026.
Unidentified anomalous phenomena, what the public historically calls UFOs.
Right.
This act mandates that all federal government records relating to UAPs must be preserved and centralized for historical purposes.
Let's consider the magnitude of what we are discussing here. We are watching the United States Congress mutate from a terrestrial legislative body concerned with highway funding and tax brackets into an interplanetary digital governing authority. Within the margins of the defense budget, they are attempting to regulate anonymous cryptographic networks, algorithms capable of rewriting reality, the physical pollution of outer space, and the formalized disclosure of unexplained aerial phenomena.
This raises an important question, right? The scope of governance has expanded vertically into the exosphere and dimensionally into the digital void, far beyond the physical borders of the nation-state.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We move from the quiet, unanimous efficiency of protecting seniors from financial exploitation to the unyielding ideological warfare over the Dobbs anniversary and congressional stock trading, all the way to the frantic attempts to regulate space debris and the dark web. But we need to bring this massive macro-level discussion back down to you, the individual listener. How do you engage with this machinery?
Active participation in a republic requires more than casting a ballot every 2 years. If any of the mechanisms we discussed today sparked your interest, you have the ability to verify and investigate further. Visit congress.gov.
Yes, great resource.
It is a remarkably robust public database. You can search for the exact bills like H.R. 2478 for financial exploitation or S. 4784 to read the intricate language of the AI and space amendments. You can bypass the summaries and read the primary statutory text yourself.
And remember the purpose of those fiery floor speeches we analyzed. Representative Roy demanding his colleagues stop trading stocks, Senator Sanders decrying the student debt crisis, the diametrically opposed definitions of liberty surrounding the Dobbs decision. Those lawmakers are not just speaking to each other. They're speaking directly to the camera and therefore to you.
Exactly.
If those speeches reflect the values of your community, or if they deeply offend those values, pick up the phone. Call your representative's office. Let them know you are watching the floor debate.
You can also track the committee process. We detailed how the Homeland Security Committee marked up 15 bills in a single day. You can monitor upcoming markups. More importantly, when these bills eventually pass and federal agencies begin the rulemaking process to implement them, you have the right to submit public comments.
It's vital.
Democracy is a relentless daily exercise in oversight.
It requires vigilance, and we want to express our deepest gratitude to you for sharing your time and vigilance with us today. To keep this ad-free civic education resource sustainable, please use the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes for this deep dive. Your direct support is the only mechanism that allows us to spend hours reading through committee reports and translating legislative jargon into actionable knowledge.
Before we conclude, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, drawing on the historical collision we explored today. In a matter of days, this Congress will travel to Philadelphia to celebrate the Semi-Quincentennial. They will commemorate 250 years of a government founded upon a paper-based constitution drafted by men using quill pens in the 18th century.
A brilliant document, but fundamentally a product of an agrarian society.
Exactly. Yet, simultaneously, as the NDAA amendments demonstrate, that exact same legislative body is frantically attempting to regulate anonymous dark web syndicates, artificial intelligence capable of adversarial distillation, and the physical degradation of low Earth orbit. The question you have to ask yourself is this: can an 18th century paper-based legislative framework designed intentionally to be slow and deliberative actually survive the exponential, terrifying speed of a 21st century technological reality?
It is the ultimate stress test of the American experiment. We are asking a framework built for horse-drawn carriages to govern a reality defined by quantum computing and spaceflight. The engine of government is roaring, the passengers are violently arguing over the map, and the road ahead is completely uncharted. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you next time.